Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. This is Our Memphis History. I'm Mark White and I'm joined by Joe Lowry over there. This episode is all about the Italians in Memphis, how they came over from Italy in the early 1800s, settled here, began families, started companies that you still hear today. So let's meet the guys. First off, we've got John Robilio. I know you guys have probably seen those trucks rolling around town. John's a lifelong Memphian, graduated from Memphis State back in 1968 with a degree in history, immediately started teaching at Christian Brothers High School, and then received his master's from Memphis in history in 1971. John was on the 72 committee to re-elect the president. He worked in PR and advertising until 1979 when he joined the family business and was an executive at the Victor L. Robilio Company. He's an expert on the Second World War, focusing on the study of the axis of powers made up by Germany, Japan, and Italy. He's a published historian and currently working on a study of fascist Italy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Italian American whose grandparents on both sides came from the Tuscany region of Italy. He was born and raised in Memphis and attended parochial schools here. He went to work for Big John Grassani while he was in sophomore in high school, and after graduating served in the Navy as both active duty and as a naval reservist. He went back to work for Big John while attending State Tech and Memphis State, where he graduated and began work with Holiday Inns, and then FedEx, where he retired from back in 2014. He's a charter member and past president of Memphis chapter of the UNICO, National Italian American Service Organization, past president of the Memphis Italian Society, and a current member of the Knights of Columbus. Mike currently works in transportation logistics consultant and lives in Middleton, Tennessee. Next up, our third guest is Drew Canale. Drew was born in Memphis, attended Christian Brothers High School, graduated Memphis State magna cum laude in '79, and the law school there in 1981. He practiced law with Gerber, and AG from '81 to '87, and then in '87 founded the Canale Farms, where he's been since that time serving as its president. Canale Farms is located in beautiful Oakland, Tennessee. If you ever get a chance, go out there and take a look at that. This episode was recorded at the Memphis Room in the Memphis Public Library down on Poplar. And so let's listen in as Mike walks us through some of those first families. We've got a book of all the families that came over in the early 1800s, and he's going to run through those. And then we'll just join the guys as we talk more and more about Italians in Memphis.
46 Twyman Directory, which is the earliest reference that we have. The following Italian families were found in this directory: J. Barbieri, J.D. Bato, A. Chirella, M. Sacala, J. Francioli, who was in the China glassware business, and then a Gaspar Francioli, who owned the Memphis Coffee House. There was a F. Masseri, there was a A. Moretto, there was a L. Montadonico, there was an A. Montadonico, there was a F. Ralgio, A. Vaccaro, and J. Cafello.
And so, as you said, those families came over in 1846. So really the first Italians that we can go back to and track to come into America.
True.
They had all types of different jobs, it sounds like. We know a little bit about them, and we can talk about some of those names if we know some. And I know, John, you had some thoughts on that.
Well, I think Drew made a good point that those Italians that arrived in the Memphis area before 1861, the beginning of the American Civil War, they were educated men. They had a degree of influence. They wanted to supplement their income, supplement their fortunes, and they regarded America as an ideal place to increase their wealth, to increase their affluence. But these were educated men.
Keep in mind, Italy was a divided country in 1846. It was not unified yet.
Okay, all right.
So that's another reason why they came over here, because they weren't able to exert the same level of influence in their trades or crafts in their homeland as they could over here.
And so they saw what America had to offer the world at that point was economic
The majority
prosperity.
of these people, and I've researched just about every one of them, either was in the confection, food, wine, and or liquor, saloon, or something that you consumed, and pretty much quality stuff.
There are a lot of restaurants, obviously. We still hear those names
Absolutely,
today.
and if you go back in history, the Francioli family, they got into the hotel business,
Right.
which actually started out as in the restaurant business. And they ran a very fashionable, really nice hotel here in town. And you can track all these y'all's families. You can track all this back to
Well, I think
quality.
that I think that if you look at the early Italians, in fact, not only the early Italians, most Italians, and when you agree, Drew, they're very entrepreneurial. They like to have their own businesses. They like to be their own bosses. They like to create wealth, affluence for their families, and they really, I think, have a real reputation of being entrepreneurial wherever they go.
For some reason, they saw Memphis as a fertile ground for business. A lot of these men were businessmen, and they were looking to make money. They were looking to invest, to start oyster houses and liquor stores and bars, restaurants. The produce and the farmers, they came later because that's
Good
hard
point.
work.
Right.
That's hard
Good
work.
point.
You know,
Good
that
point.
takes years to cultivate. These guys wanted money, and they decided, a lot of them, to stay. One of the gentlemen that's not on that list that I think should be mentioned, and he's got a really, really interesting family, is the Guadalupos. Vincent Guadalupo. All these guys, these early Italians, you know, they were all friends. It was like a little club. You know, they were all from about the same area: Genoa, northern Italy, Liguria, right there. And you got to think, it took Dominic, when he came in '59, but you can imagine back in the '40s, it took Dominic 64 days on a sailing ship. Now, not a steamer.
Right.
This is like, you know, you put the sails up, you go across the ocean, you know, you might make it, you might not.
Right.
You know, that's why these guys. So it took a lot of guts to come over here and start
Sure
a
did.
business. And there was a man named Vincent Guadalupo who had a lot of money years ago when he came, and he sponsored a lot of these younger Italians, and he wanted more Italians to come. I started doing research in the Canali family. I was just a regular guy, didn't have history on my mind. Trying to raise a family like everybody else and have a business. And in 2000, the Canalis had a really bad year. We lost 4, of our family members. And of course, we all go to Canali Funeral Home. There's a plug. And we would see each other. We would see each other at the funeral, crying. And I thought to myself, it would be a really good thing if we could all get together and see each other and party and have a drink and eat and talk about the old times other than at a funeral.
Yeah.
That's a
So
good point.
we started in 2001 out at our farm. We did our first family reunion. There was about 300 of us.
Wow.
And that's how I kind of got into it. And people would bring me information on the Canalis, and I kind of started gathering and looking. And over time, I traced everything back to, a lot of it began with this gentleman, Vincent Guadalupo, who's very, very interesting. He had a wife that came over at 16 years old. He sent for her, and she ended up staying pregnant almost every year of her life. She had 16 kids here in Memphis, and she ended up passing away in '78 with the yellow fever. But anyway, that's another story. Vincent Guadalupo. He was, if he's not on that list,
He appeared in 1859.
59?
1859.
Okay. That's when Dominic came.
Right.
That's when Dominic came. But
Before the American Civil War.
yeah, before the Civil
And
War.
Go
I'm
ahead, Mike.
I'm familiar with his name, with Vincent's name, because in 1870 there was a group chartered here in Memphis, and it was chartered in the state of Tennessee, and it was called the Society de Unione e Fratellanza Italiana, which means the Society of the Union of the Italian Brotherhood. And Mr. Gallupo was part of that group, along with, there was a Signiego, as I recall, there was a DeMarco, but it was kind of a list of some of the early Italian names in Memphis. But as a matter of fact, from that, they actually had an Italian hall down on 2nd Street at 136, 138 South 2nd Street around the turn of the century. But to this date, that charter is still in existence in the state of Tennessee, that early charter. And so I know he was early on formed a group of Italians here in Memphis. Mr. Bacigalupo did.
Yes.
I think 1870 is a very important date for all of us. Officially speaking, that's when Italy becomes a modern state.
Right.
Italy is
Exactly.
unified in 1870.
Right.
Drew had mentioned that there are naturally many Italians that are entrepreneurial, manufacturers, distillers, retailers. My grandfather, though, his roots were strictly agrarian. My grandfather was a farmer, and for generations, his people, our people, had been farmers in Bussignano, which is located on the Po River in northern Italy. And it was and is a very fertile area. And my grandfather, they would raise fruits and vegetables, and he made his living initially as a venditore ambulante, simply someone who sells fruits and vegetables house by house. Apparently, there were a lot of opportunities for farming in the Mid-South after the American Civil War, and that's the second wave, the farmers.
I actually have a stat here that says that 90% of all food eaten in Memphis between 1880 and 1830 were grown by only 25 different families.
It was either
It's
grown
amazing.
or sold.
Exactly. They got every bit of
that
it.
is
Yeah.
a central
I've got
point.
the list
That's
here.
a central
Exactly,
point.
yeah.
I have the truck farmers list. I can't pronounce them, but you can. There you go.
Mike's going to handle that for us.
What year is this, Joe? Turn of the century?
Pretty close to it, yeah.
Okay,
And from about 1930 to about 1940 and
Right.
even into the 50s.
Okay.
And you'll recognize every one of these.
I know. Some
And
of
the
early
farms,
truck
Mike,
farmers.
they were like in Frazier.
Yes.
Up in
There's a
Frazier.
lot of them up on, of course, on Highway 51.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
Macon
then there was a
Road.
lot of them down on 61, down
Good
in
point.
Whitehaven and on into Mississippi.
And then there was one out by Bunton, the city of Bunton, or the
Yes.
I think you're right.
out
I
there
think
in
there
Bunton.
was.
There's
Truck-
one in the Bunton
truck farmers,
community.
that's
The,
what we're called,
the
right.
Pianos and the Berettas owned that chunk of property. Colonial on the west, Park on the south, the railroad track on the north, and where Mount Moriah is on the east. That was in 1900. In fact, there's a house at 720 or 740 something Colonial that was built in 1900. The house is there, and I've looked at the overhead aerial maps for the 1930s, and none of those houses were there. It was all farmland.
It wasn't Memphis back then, was it?
Oh,
No.
in the 30s,
No,
yes,
no,
in
no,
the 30s. It was in the county.
But,
Yeah, the county.
but you know, if you consider from what 1880 to after the First World War, I think we made a very good point that the production, the wholesaling and retailing of food dominated by Italians or heavily influenced by Italians.
And it was because we were such a wonderful transportation hub here. We had bridges that came across the Mississippi. We had 5 major railroads. We had 175 steamboat companies, packet boats, and other boat companies that utilized our harbor here. So we're moving products in and out. We're moving them out by train. If you go back to the 1900s, early 1900s, the area that was Montgomery, where Montgomery and Bellevue is, where Tech High School is,
Yeah.
there used to be an alley that ran up in there, and that alley was called Bacigalupo Alley, and the family actually had a truck farm in the early 1900s. So they were supplying food to everybody at that period of time. If you go over on White Station Road between Brenton and Rich, you have a street called Bryn Ridge. That was even up into the 70s. That was still a truck farm
Or
there.
the Podesta family. They obviously were truck gardeners
Yes.
in the White Station and Summer area.
Exactly. Same way with Summer and between Stratford and Avon. That
Good
whole
point.
area up there was truck farm.
The Belmont at Poplar and Mendenhall was an Italian grocery store run by the Bianchi family.
Yeah.
That's right. Do you want to read the list?
Oh, here's the
These
list
are
of the truck
farmer
farmers at the
list.
turn of the century.
And before we do that, a truck farmer, for all our listeners, let's make sure they know what that is. That is a family that would farm and then bring their food in
On
via truck.
four-strong carriage or on their trucks
Definitely.
later on, yes, that's what we call them.
Before you
Very
read that,
early in the morning.
yeah, let me tell you how this worked, and this is passionate with me because I grew up in North Memphis. I grew up over on Avalon until I was 9 years old, north of Jackson and south of Valentine. And these people would raise the best crops in the world, and they'd load their trucks up or their wagons up and bring them in, and at 4 o'clock in the morning they would take it around to the most fashionable restaurant. They'd take it around to Francioli's, Luhrmann's, and Gaston's, and let the cook come out and pick through and pick the very best, most tenderest leaves, and then they would go over to the grocery stores and then let the grocer come out and pick the next batch of tenderest leaves, and then they would take this stuff over to, which was first the farmers market where Nathan Bedford Forest Park is, and then over to the Curb Market in later years, and sell it to people. I'm going to work, I stop at the farmer's market, I get a big old slab of tomato, and I get a hunk of bread, and if I'm lucky, somebody will give me some Duke's mayonnaise, and I slap it on there, and I call it lunch. And after that, and when I'm 6 years old, I can remember this guy named Tony. I don't know his name, but he had a
Evangelisti,
mule.
was it Tony Evangelisti?
I don't know.
There's so many.
I'm 6
Or
years
Palazzolo,
old.
right,
This
right.
is
Who knows?
This is 1956. I can't remember what I did yesterday.
Joe, they still do this.
Well,
They still do this.
he would-
Palazzolo Produce,
he would-
M. Palazzolo
on
Produce.
now.
Yes,
Except
and
he
you're
doesn't
right.
grow it. He buys it, but
He's a wholesaler.
instead of a
isn't he?
horse and a buggy, it's a big green
This
truck.
guy had a
Bob
big,
Palazzolo
rickety.
and the Shiras. They
Yeah,
are
the
wholesalers.
Shiras.
They're wholesalers.
He-
Food, right.
He had this big rickety wagon, and he
Today
would
they
get
do.
on our street, and he would drive up Avalon behind the mule, and he'd ring this bell, and my grandmother, Miss Handworker, would come out, Mrs. Colton would come out, Miss Evangelista would come out, and everybody would come out and right there and gather around, and whatever was left, turnip greens, turnips, onions, whatever, my grandmother would, she'd pick this, pick that, and we're going to have turnip greens and cornbread and black-eyed peas that she bought off of that wagon. I'm 6 years old. I remember this just as
But Joe, those skills were developed in many, of course, regarding our family in the Po Valley, because for generations the Robilio family had been heavily involved in farming. And you know, my grandfather, when he arrived here in 1901, the first thing he does, he becomes a truck farmer, because that is what he did, and his grandfather and his great-grandfather had done in Bassignana on the Po River.
In Italy. They did it there, so they brought it here.
Many of your rice farmers in the Delta today come from a region, their ancestors came from Ancona on the Adriatic coast, and that was where a lot of rice is grown to this day. Okay, risotto in Italian. But a lot of these third, fourth generation farmers are down in the Delta now growing rice.
Still there today.
Still there.
Still there today.
Really? Do you think you can manage through that list and pronounce?
Here's a list
all
at
of
the
them that
turn
I
of the
cannot?
century. Vittorio Cascia, he operated 3 farms. Also the Angelo family, Dall'Asta family, the Fracchias, the Cervivo, Laguzzi, Bursi, Trotta, Guasco, Amasano, Bellosomo, and Torta.
Kind of a who's who of the farmers back then.
Pretty much.
Many of those names are very familiar to me because they are from the province of Piemonte or from Piedmont, where of course my grandfather originated.
A lot of these are Bassignana names. I know
You're right.
The Bursi, the Tortas, I know they're from Bassignana.
Right, that's correct.
Very good.
So one of the things that we know was going on back then was the caste system, which was kind of prevalent back then, and it affected Italians. It affected everybody, but I'm sure it affected Italians. We want to talk a little bit about that kind of aristocracy.
It's a shame. It's just one of those things that we're aware of today, and we were real aware of it. But if you were Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, or African American, equally, you were part of a caste system. And you were looked
Yeah.
down upon by what were known as the Blue Bloods of Memphis. And the Blue Bloods of Memphis are considered to be Episcopalian and Presbyterian and big money. Cotton money, lumber money, grocery and commodity business money. Big money, didn't matter where it came from. Was it right? No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But was it life? Yes.
Joe was making a very powerful and sad point. My father graduated from CBC in 1929, and for a while he worked for the family business Ronco. Then he went to work for Malone and Hyde, and he sold sugar and bread and basic foodstuffs in the Memphis area. He had a customer, a prominent Memphian, a gentleman that was a small manufacturer. And my father called upon him, and the owner of the company said, "Mr. Abilio, you are a Roman Catholic. You are of Italian origin. I am very opposed to the heavy influx of Central Europeans and Eastern Europeans in the Mid-South. I really don't want to buy anything from you." He did not buy anything from my father simply because my dad was a Roman Catholic and because my grandfather had been from Italy. Joe's point is powerfully made. It's a sad point, but it's a point we have to accept.
In 1922, the construction of St. Thomas Church down on Trigg, South Memphis, was underway. And that was at the time when the Ku Klux Klan, probably in the late teens, sadly, they were probably at their deathbed at the turn of the century, but they had a resurgence right about the time of World War I, after the war, and into the 20s. And this church was being built, Catholic church, and they hired some artisans from Italy to do some of the stonework. And the Ku Klux Klan was upset, and my father, at that time, my father was about 15 years old. He was a sophomore at CBC, and he lived not too far away on Wellington there, and heard about a big commotion, and the KKK had burned a cross at that construction site there. So that was something vivid in my father's memory, and I remember my father always saying the KKK, they did not like blacks, they did not like Jews, they did not like Catholics, and they didn't like immigrants. We're 2 out of 4.
Yeah, two of them checked off.
And there's a second part to this.
Joe knows the second part of this burning of the cross.
When they got their information wrong, and they thought they were burning it at the church, but they weren't, because they were burning it in Miss Kelly's yard across the street. And Mrs. Kelly was a very, very, as Father Joel has in his book Between the Rivers, he describes it as she wasn't happy, and
She may have been boarding some of the Italian laborers. I
She
believe.
probably
Probably
was.
was.
And so she would go, runs down the steps, puts the fire out, grabs the cross, and starts clobbering the Klansmen. They didn't want to mess with her. I can understand that. And the other part to this is when they were trying to build the grotto, the Protestants that lived in the area did not want that Catholic church to be built there. And so at night, after the stone guys were working on the church, they would go down and tear the bricks out. And so it's my understanding that the priest, or a priest and a member of the congregation, I guess you would call it, decided to go down with a rifle and shoot bullets over the top of their heads, and they would actually shoot from Marksman and Lucy, which is on the backside, and the eastern Marksman is the street just east of, and Lucy's the street in the rear. And then they would run around the corner and be at the corner of Lauderdale and Trigg and shoot the other way to discourage. And these were actual members of the Protestant churches who did not want the Catholic Church there, and were doing whatever they could do to keep it. And this is, you got to understand the community that we're dealing with here. This was very blue collar. This was a lot of railroad people, a lot of people that worked on the river, police officers. We know for a fact there were 17 firefighters. We've researched them that lived in that parish. And there were 14 police officers that lived in there. So this is a working class, very working class. I would call it a lower middle class neighborhood. Good people, good people.
We believe you. And Mark, I wanted to make this point that roughly speaking from about 1880 to the First World War, of course the First World War ends in 1918, enormous waves
Right.
of immigrants
That's
from
exactly
Italy.
right.
I mean,
Right.
not only from Italy, but from most parts of Europe.
Europe,
that's
But
right.
then during the 1920s, for a variety of reasons, that immigration laws are greatly strengthened. It's difficult now to migrate. Now, this is going to be not only difficult for Italians, but it will be tragic for the people in Eastern Europe. Those Jews that want to leave Eastern Europe in the 1820s and, in the 1920s and the 1930s, they will encounter great difficulties. Those that are not fortunate in obtaining passage, obviously, will be victims of the Holocaust. But in the 1920s, immigration laws become very strict, and it's much harder to migrate from Central Europe and Eastern Europe to the U.S.
Right. And still talking about immigration today.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, big
still
time,
are.
exactly. Who's in and who's out?
Yeah. So I've got some notes here about some of the country clubs. Let's talk a little bit
Mike,
about them.
you-
I know that was
Well,
a
you know,
big part.
I guess the oldest one is Memphis Country Club, and I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't know who the first Italian, or if there ever was Italian in Memphis Country Club.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
But,
because I
go
think
ahead.
the Drews family,
Were they in it?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
For
yes.
a long
Grandmother.
time, they wouldn't allow them in, though. Right?
Now that's my understanding, Drew. You would know, but that's my understanding. Initially, they were not welcome.
Let me make this
Go ahead,
point.
Drew. You know,
You know,
When the first Italians came over, we said a lot of them had money, and a lot of them stuck together. And they knew when they came. They knew the Italians, everyone that rowed the boat over, they were thinking, you know, what are these people going to think of us? Are they going to be prejudiced? Certainly they expected it. They knew that it was coming. So how do you get around that? How do you avoid, prejudice and not letting you in the clubs and not letting you in the schools? Well, what my family did, and a lot of families, a lot of Italians and a lot of Germans, the formula was assimilate and become an American as quick as you can. And I know that the old canales, if you look back on the walls, they didn't have Italian flags on there. They didn't have Italian cakes. They were American. They fought for America. They wanted to become American lawyers, American judges.
right.
So that was the first thing they did. And the second thing you want to do is have as many kids as you possibly can. Of course, that's part of being Catholic.
Right.
And if there's safety in numbers, you've heard. Okay, so they had a lot of big family. They wanted the family
Right.
to grow. The family's the tree.
Yeah.
The family's the root of everything. So assimilate, have as much family, invest in land. Buy as much land as you possibly can. It's like playing Monopoly. And that's what they did. And
Well, those kids to work the farms that everybody
and they,
had,
and they
and that's
stuck
a big
together.
part of
So the early ones in my family, I guess maybe I'm too young. Maybe they've seen it, but I hadn't seen a lot of it. My grandmother, Arnett Sterla, of course, Sterla, she was an Italian from Genoa. She was one of the first in the Memphis Country Club.
She was.
Yeah.
But you know what year that was?
That was back in 30s. That was in the 30s.
Because I heard that almost being Catholic when you weren't allowed in.
Well, what divided them was the money.
Okay.
Very
And if
good
you had the
point.
money,
Well,
you're in. We really like you.
You're
And your
in.
name's not Canale anymore. We're going to make you McAnally.
You're in.
I think money's still,
If you've got the money, we're going to change. You
You're
know what I'm
in.
saying?
Yeah.
So it developed like now. There's also a caste system in the family. There's a lot of family members in the Canale family that are well-to-do, and some that are truck farmers. Inside the family, and you have to know that. You have to know, where you can go, where you can't. So the numbers, there were so many of them. Today, I think if I was to send an invitation and had a family reunion, there's over 1,000 Canales in Memphis.
Wow.
That go back because they got here so early and they had boys.
That's right.
Dominic had 5 boys. George had 5 boys.
Yeah.
My father had 3, so there's a lot of them. And the numbers, there was safety in numbers. But they still recognized, John's father got here in 1901. Well, Dominic already had a huge family, and 2 of his sons were attorneys. So they weren't going to let people be prejudiced and not let them in the Memphis Country Club because they had the legal. Where did they go to school? They sent them to the best schools they could. They sent them to George Washington Catholic University, and this is back in the 1800s, going to Catholic University. So, that kind of prevented it. It made things a little bit different.
Mark, I'd like to amplify Drew's comments. My grandfather arrived here in 1901. Maybe he knew 50 words of English, but he studied English. He went to night school. Now, he had a rule, and this is a point that Drew has made, that my grandfather informed his children, you are not Italians, you are Americans.
Right.
And you are to speak English, and you are not to learn Italian
As quick as you possibly can.
unless you go to school and independently you learn Italian. My father, Victor Robilio, did not speak Italian. I learned Italian at the University of Memphis. And there were many people like me that decided to learn Italian because it's a vital part of our culture. But my grandfather did not permit the speaking of Italian at his home. And also something my grandfather greatly promoted, he said, if someone is from Sicily, they are to be respected. Because Drew, Michael, when you agree that for a while, Joe, Sicilians regrettably were the victims of discrimination. I mean, Northern Italians would say...
They were kind of... It was worse for them, and a lot of it came from the Cosa Nostra.
That's
Mafia.
right.
Absolutely,
That's exactly right.
absolutely.
The origin of the Cosa Nostra was protection from the Spanish soldiers that occupied Sicily.
Right.
The soldiers were raping the women, they were extorting the merchants, so the men got together and formed this Mafia Cosa Nostra for protection, self-preservation really, from the Spanish. But it evolved into something, more than that. It got powerful, and then, so that's kind of why a lot of Sicilians have, thought of that way.
Mike, that's a good
the birth
point.
of the mafioso.
That's a good point. If you look at Italy, south of Rome and Sicily, if you look at that geographic area, it will be dominated by France and Spain. Mm-hmm. And obviously, all of Italy, southern Italy and Sicily, and then northern Italy. I mean, France, Austria, Spain, and of course, they dominate Italy, and particularly in Sicily, it's a very oppressive government.
My father used to call them the dark hands.
That's right.
They were called the dark
That's what they
hands.
were called,
And they were probably a little darker people being closer to the equator.
Well,
They had been conquered. Regrettably, Sicily suffered several invasions from North Africa, Muslim soldiers. And so...
Hannibal crossed the Alps, he came up through Italy, so...
Right, yeah, he comes through northern... He
sure does.
Comes through northern Italy.
Right.
And but Sicilians, regrettably, were the victims of discrimination by other Italians.
Yes.
Sure. I want to go back to something you said about them assimilating by going in and starting to speak English and not Italian. It makes perfect sense. It speaks to their success. They weren't going to be able to come into America and Memphis and sell things speaking Italian. No one would be able to do that.
Exactly
parents-
right.
Perfect
It's
sense.
good for business.
It's smart.
It's good for business.
My
There you
parents
go.
spoke very, very poor English. Italian was their first language because their parents came over here.
Sure.
And when they went to school, my dad went to St. Patrick's downtown, and my mother went to St. Agnes when it was down on Vance. And the nuns taught them English. And my parents spoke perfect English. They didn't speak a broken English, even though
Right.
Italian was their first tongue.
Yeah. Amazing.
But they were very fluent in both languages.
Yeah. Just part of assimilating
but-
and
yeah,
being
they-
successful. There was no other way to do that.
But the
It's just
nuns
smart.
spent special time with them to teach them English.
Right.
And you see a lot of Italians, and this has to do with being a Catholic too. They went to good Catholic schools.
Right.
They studied hard by the nuns and the brothers.
Right.
The Christian brothers have played a tremendous part
They sure
in
have.
helping the Italians in Memphis.
Right.
I don't think that goes,
I agree.
unmarked
I agree.
right there. We need to really, give credit to what the Christian brothers have done for the Canale family, for a lot of
A
Italians.
lot of
I think, Drew, I
tremendous
think you're right.
educational
That
impact.
tremendous thankfulness to them and congratulations to the brothers.
So we've talked a lot about different industries and different occupations. What about politics? I'm sure there was probably a few Italians in the
Yeah,
politics.
probably the most famous early on was Frank L. Monteverdi, and Monteverdi's parents came from Italy. He was born here in Memphis, and he had several occupations. He had been a bookkeeper. He had been in the funeral business, but he had also been a legislator at the state level, state of Tennessee, and he had become sheriff. As a matter of fact, as a footnote, he presided over the last hanging in Shelby County. In 1917 elections, Monteverdi ran against the Crump man, and I don't remember the Crump man's name.
His name was Crump.
No, Crump didn't run in 1917,
I
but
can't
he had
remember.
put one of his lackeys up.
I can't remember.
And
who it was.
Monteverdi ran, well, he basically ran against the machine, which was unheard of. Now, keep in mind, this is 12 years before LaGuardia ran against Tammany Hall in New York, another machine. So, and LaGuardia is well known for that, but Monteverdi beat a machine 12 years earlier. In the South, elected an Italian Catholic mayor.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
It was just,
Phenomenal.
it really was. It was unheard of. And of special note, Mayor Monteverdi appointed the first blacks as detectives on the police department. So think about how unheard that was in 1917.
I was going to say back.
They did not stay.
Yeah.
They were only in there for about 6 months.
Okay.
They encountered so much heartache
Yeah.
and grief
But
from their peers,
Right.
not from the community, but other police officers. And
Less than a
and
year.
that would be repeated again in 1947 when African Americans were hired by the police department, the first
yeah.
that actually stayed.
Joe, tell them about the Georgia story that you. George Canale was my grandfather. He was the youngest son of old Dominic that came over in '59, and he was educated in. He went to Catholic University and Georgetown Law School.
I'm going to read this. In 1920, when 35 to 36 states had ratified the 19th Amendment, the battle lines had been drawn for the deciding vote that would determine what state, the state of Tennessee, and that's where it ended up. Those pro and those opposed to the women's right to vote in Nashville, to see who could, they all came together to see who could change the ideas of the legislatures. The vote had been tied between 48 for and 48 against. And now it's time for Tennessee to make or break the new law. Edward Hall Crump, our local benevolent power broker, told legislator George A. Canale to vote against the amendment, as he did not want women to have the right to vote. Canale had to know that if he disobeyed Mr. Crump, his political future would be over. Sometimes there are things that are just more important than your political career. And I think this really required an awful lot of courage on his part. On August the 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state and the deciding state the right to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote in U.S. elections. George A. Canale was a lawyer, a legislator, a successful businessman. He was not reelected a second term, just as was expected, because when you crossed Mr. Crump, it did not matter. You were done. He was a gifted speaker, well sought out for conventions and other public functions. He had won distinctions in many endeavors in his life, and at the time of his sudden death at age 46, he was sales manager for Deacon Alley and Company His pallbearers were the honorary pallbearers included a who's who of Memphis makers, who most you would recognize the names of everybody today.
He actually died
We're
at
talking
44.
real courage here.
Yeah. My father told me that story for years. I heard it, for all the times. And the story goes that some people had said that it was his mother that told him, look, you better vote like this, you better vote with the women. But I look back, and his mother died, Antoinette died, was about 1912 or 1913, so it couldn't have been that. So it was more than likely it was his wife, Arnett Sterling, that really convinced him to do that.
What a display of courage.
Oh, absolutely.
Ended his political career.
Yeah.
Did it?
But the greater good was served. So that's what's so noble about what he did, really.
And it would have been hard to regroup all that vote and get it again. It probably, it would have happened, but who knows when it would have happened.
There was another person that voted. He wasn't.
He wasn't the final
No,
vote.
he
It
wasn't.
came down to it was tied in
Yes.
this legislature.
And he and another person who I can't remember who that is because
he's the
when I wrote this thing, it was all about
Right.
George, and what he had done through the years.
But they needed George's vote. They had to have George's vote. It was
Exactly.
just one vote.
Yeah,
Wow.
how cool is that?
He had exceptional courage.
Yes.
Certainly with those
I think that
times.
is just cool.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. So, what about were any Italian? There were no Italians in the police or fire, right?
There were not many.
That was sarcasm.
Yeah, the police department had a Venucci, had a
My ancestor,
Chiosa.
Arata, Rolando Arata, a police officer.
There was only about had a John Fapiano. There were only about four between in the early 1900s, 4 or 5 at the most. Fire department was even worse. We had a Louis Casaretto. We had a Louis Cuneo. In fact, I just recently did a study on Cuneo. Cuneo was only 5 feet tall, and he started out his career on a truck company. He was on Truck 3, which at the time was a horse-drawn truck company. He worked his way up from private all the way up to captain. Sometime in the early 1900s, I can't remember the date, I've got it at the house, they had a building collapse. A 4-story building collapsed, trapped a bunch of people, and he was able to, small enough to crawl through, and he crawled in there and rescued a whole bunch of people. And so, and then we had a chief, Julius Ventrini, who was assistant chief, and then he was fire chief for about a year during this period. But Mr. Crump did not want to have a lot of Italians because if he had more than about 5 or 6, they would gather together and become a group, a mob, and he didn't want to have to control them. He knew that he could not, they were going to be difficult to control, so he kept the numbers small. And for the most part, most of our police department was Irish, and most of our fire department was Irish during that period of time, up until about 1930, 20s and 30s. And then more and more kept coming, and all of them were great. Every single one of them was either a sergeant, a detective, or they were on the emergency squad, which today we would call the SWAT team. All the guys that were on the fire department all made rank. I mean, they were all quality people. So,
I agree.
So we've got up to about the 1925, 1930. What's going on in Memphis with Italians after that point
very,
in time?
very important. There were 2 groups of Italians as far as organizations, and we mentioned the Italian Brotherhood. There was also the sons of Vittorio Emanuele, who was the king of Italy, and he had been when Italy was reestablished as a unified country. Vittorio Emanuele becomes the king. It's kind of like the King of England, though it's not really a monarchy, in Italy. But anyway, those 2 groups, the sons of Vittorio Emanuele and the Italian Brotherhood, they merge, and the Memphis Italian Society is born.
Okay, what years?
Around 1936.
Okay.
And John Lucchese was instrumental in getting those two groups together, merging them. But one of the things that it did was not only, the Italians had a place to gather, as a group and have functions, but also they sold insurance, to families, because I think Italians had kind of a difficult time really going out. Maybe they didn't have the money, or for various reasons they could not but get insurance. So they all kind of like paid dues, but that dues was applied towards insurance, and they helped out families in need. So if a family lost, back then, of course, the husband or the father was a bread earner, and if they lost that person, then that money was used to help that family out. So it was kind of like a more versus a societal kind of organization, but they also worked very hard to get other Italians over here from Italy, do the paperwork. As John had said, it had gotten a little bit more complicated then, the paperwork and all that. They didn't know English, so that group, also headed by John Lucchese, played an instrumental role. And as I recall, as early as I can remember, back in the 50s, we had an Italian club down on Neely Road, where St. Joseph Catholic Church is today. And we had boccialis. We had a big building that had a banquet hall on one end. It had a bar in the middle, and it had a card room at the other end. We had baseball diamonds. We had a wading pool. We had a fishing lake.
Wow.
It was really almost like a big, huge farm
Big
out
community
in
center farm,
Whitehaven.
Mark, I can remember my grandfather regrettably died in November of 1929. He was only 46 years old. But as Mike has related, after the First World War, Mussolini gained power in 1922.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Memphis community, it was fascinating and it was discouraging, because you had Italians that strongly supported the fascist regime. They said, well, Mussolini, he has made Italy proud again. He has improved the infrastructure of Italy. He's made Italy a great technological country. And you had that group that commended Mussolini. And then you had those Italians that said, also, he is basically the creator of a police state. He is very anti-Semitic. He is imperialistic in thinking. And so there was, so to speak, a division. You had Italians in the Memphis area that applauded Benito Mussolini and the fascist government. And Mike has made a good point. Yes, Italy has a king, but he is not a strong political figure.
Not really.
He has limited power. The fascists run Italy from 1922 until 1943, and they run Italy disastrously.
Well, again, they did a lot as far as industrializing the country, because it was still pretty backwards at that time. But again, he made some bad decisions who he was going to ally with.
So that brings us up to about 1935 or so. So what else is going on in Memphis right now? What's Memphis look like? John?
1935 is a very important date to Italians in the Memphis area. In 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia, and within a year he seizes the entire country. The Italian government, the fascists, become very unpopular because, in effect, this is a major imperialistic endeavor. Italy now is beginning to drift to Nazi Germany, and many Italians, they see this drift, and they know what type man Adolf Hitler is, but they can't deny Italy is moving toward an alliance with Nazi Germany.
Interesting times. What else is going on?
Well, we're in the middle of the Great Depression.
Right.
And I think the Italians that probably made their money up to that point probably did not keep all of it in the bank, prudently.
Right, as most people didn't.
Yeah, they kept it at home, hidden or whatever. But I think there was, for a lot of Italians, there was a struggle for just trying to find jobs. I think there was a lot of movement among a lot of the other non-Italian laborers at that time, you just picked up a job wherever you could. I know that, my father, he really did not really get into a very solid job until right before the war. So it was like the early 40s. And so he did a lot of things. He worked Feinberg Packing Company out on Warford, still there today. And interestingly enough, when Mr. Feinberg needed to go downtown to the bank, he called upon my father to drive him downtown to the bank. But anyway, so I think that was pretty common among a lot of Italians, and there's a lot of Irish, a lot of as well. It's just trying to find a solid career. They were starting families, a lot of them, and those families were growing. It was just finding, the right occupation.
Sure.
And
It just shows the tenacity, and
right.
they're going to go find the job that gets them the next, meal.
In the
wanna
late
honor
30s,
that.
I was mentioned one gentleman here, and my father said that he was the best athlete he ever saw about in Memphis, and that was Joe Chioza, who played for the Philadelphia Athletics, and a Major League Baseball player. I think maybe one of the first Memphians to really hit. I know the first Italian American
Yes,
Memphian to make it to the big leagues, and he later became a pilot in World War II, bomber pilot. So
My father worked in 1935 for Malone and Hyde. He told me he made $40 a week, and he was the most grateful person in the world. As Michael has related, the Depression was devastating. My dad called upon most of the state of Mississippi, and as we know, so many banks had plunged into bankruptcy, enormous unemployment. In fact, my dad, who was a very generous, a very sensitive, a very kind man, he would give some of his samples to individuals that had no job and that were looking for food. The Depression was devastating in the Mid-South.
That brings us up a little bit, up until about the 1935, 1940 spirit and time frame. But we're going to go back, and we're going to do this in 2 episodes. And so the next one will start around 1920, and we're going to go up into the present day, all of the occupations, the businesses, the places that you as a listener are going to be able to see and hear and you're familiar with at that point. So again, gentlemen, this has been an amazing time. All of the information and the knowledge around this table is very honoring for me to be here. I feel very blessed to be able to spend the time with you. We're going to go back through and talk a little bit more next time, and we appreciate everybody's listening, and thanks. Be sure to check us out online at ourmemphishistory.com, on Facebook, on Twitter, and wherever you get your podcasts.